At the turn of the millennium, we were living in Mozambique. We'd chosen to live in a town on the Zambezi River, close to the delta. We had bought some land in a part of the town where there were no other expatriates living. We were surrounded by Mozambican people. We had chosen to build our home with local materials that were readily available. We had tried to simplify our lives as much as we could so that we could try to live amongst Mozambicans and build genuine relationships with them. As the town began to develop, a few expatriates began to move in. And there was a point where we met a young South African family who lived on the other side of the town, where the other expatriates were living. We made friends with them. They were a fun couple. They were our age. And particularly I remember in sort of September, October, November time when the heat was becoming oppressive, incredibly high humidity. It was fantastic to leave our house, which had no electricity, no running water, to cycle over to their place, arrive hot and sweaty, and go into a cold, air-conditioned house, which had a generator powering the electricity, with a fridge, with ice-cold sodas. And they even had a satellite dish and DSTV, and I could watch Premier League football. There was something fun and refreshing about having friends that we could easily talk to and a home that was cold. But there was quite a contrast between that and our normal everyday life. And I can remember one day when it was very marked, when we left there to go and have the evening meal with a young Mozambican couple who were also friends of ours. They lived in a small hut. They cooked us a simple meal of maize and fish. We sat in their hut in the semi-dark eating with them. The contrast between those two lifestyles was marked. And at that time, I remember really wrestling with this issue. How do I posture myself? How do I choose to live on a daily basis when I live in such a divided world? To back up a little bit and put this in some context, Mozambique was a Portuguese colony. Portugal, back in the 1920s, essentially privatised the land of Mozambique, and that part of Mozambique, Marameo, was bought up by a British company called Senna. They bought the charter for the lower Zambezi Valley. When you fly into Marameo now, you fly in, you see beautiful, open, lush, green vegetation because it's low-lying floodplains. And the Senna company quickly discovered that this land was ideal for growing sugar. They developed a huge sugar plantation network in the area. They built a sugar refinery in Marameo. They built a railway line from Marameo down to the port of Beira. And Marameo became the biggest sugar producing area in Africa. The town developed a kind of a unique Portuguese colonial feel. There were wide boulevards, large Portuguese style houses. But then came the War for Independence. 1975, after years of war, independence came. By that point the factory was pretty run down, and then 17 years of civil war. The post office in town was bombed, the bank was destroyed, the railway was literally overturned in the war. The factory lay derelict and empty. It hadn't worked for years. And by the mid-1990s, Mozambique finally had peace after 3 decades, but Marameo was a ghost town. And when we arrived, these wide, empty streets were crumbling. The houses, although beautiful, were derelict. Around the turn of the millennium, Mozambique was building and developing fast. There was plenty of foreign aid coming in, structural adjustment programs, the World Bank was at work, and Mozambique were attracting and encouraging foreign investment from anywhere. South African companies were coming in and taking on wide areas of land on the beachfronts and building beautiful beach resorts. And a Mauritian company, a consortium, bought up the old sugar refinery and began to re-establish it. So we were living there in Marameo at that time when the sugar factory was being rebuilt and when it reopened. And so it was interesting to see the changes in our local society as that happened. Because it was a sugar factory, it needed workers, it needed a management group. And what they did is they basically brought in a bunch of expatriate workers. The management class, if I can call it that, were mostly English speakers. They came from places like Zimbabwe and South Africa, England, Scotland. They came in on 1 or 2 year contracts. They were people like our South African friends. They were good people. They came in, they were paid a good wage in foreign bank accounts. They lived in a compound, it was walled, it was gated, had guards at the gate. There was a large steam engine sized generator that powered all these houses. They had big houses, they had nice cold fridges with sodas on tap. They had a life which wasn't an easy life for them. They'd come from other places. They were living in a place that was hot, it was humid, there was malaria, but they had a good wage. And then there was a group of people, and there was maybe 100 in that sort of group of management, I guess. Then there was a second group, maybe a couple of hundred people. These were mostly single men. They mostly came from Mauritius. They were therefore French speakers. They were kind of the skilled artisan workers, I guess, who ran different parts of the refinery and the plantation. These were people who probably had families at home, but they came in on their own for possibly 2 months at a time, and then they would fly home for a month of respite, then they would come back. They tended to live 3 or 4 guys in a flat, a bit more basic than the management group, but they still were paid well in US dollars. They had a good job. A bunch of men together with cash in hand, not much to do. Prostitution sadly grew a lot in the town. There was a lot of alcohol abuse. Sugar is a very labour-intensive crop. It is one of the main crops behind the slave trade, and the sugar refinery in Maromeo needed a lot of labourers, unskilled labourers, and thousands of local Mozambicans were employed by the factory out in the fields. These were people who were paid the basic national minimum wage, possibly $1 a day. They had no long-term contracts. They could be hired and fired as employment needs dictated. They worked all day in the sun. They didn't get sick pay. At the end of the day, they went home to their mud huts. They had no electricity. They had no running water. They had no fridges, no nice cold drinks, unless they went to the shop and bought one. It was a tough life for them. There was a basic hospital that served their needs, but it was tough. The guys in the compound had a nice, well-resourced clinic. If there were real health issues, they could be flown out for help. And as we encountered this, we recognised that there was certainly a trickle-down effect from the boost to the local economy from work. Certainly the shops became much better stocked. People had some money to spend. And the town did begin to grow. But there was still enormous inequalities, and the inequalities and the way it was split, the demographics was such a racial split as well, it was quite marked. And so for us as we lived there, this really was an Ebenezer time in our lives. We were seeing something and we were asking questions. How do we bridge this gap? How do we live with integrity and authenticity in a place of such contrasts? I remember back 30 years or so ago to my very first economics A-level class. The teacher walked in with a box of chocolates, actually. Life is like a box of chocolates, as Forrest Gump says. And he passed around the chocolates around the class. It was assorted flavours. And as we ate these chocolates, he asked us to try to imagine which countries the various ingredients of these chocolates came from. So there would have been vanilla from Madagascar, cocoa from Ghana, Brazil nuts from Brazil, and so on. And naturally, these products came from dozens and dozens of countries. And that was a great example, and it was a really good way of introducing economics to us and global trade, the realities of global trade. There was no question of morality in the way he taught this. This was simply the way the global economy functions, that there are millions of interactions, buying and selling, things going on all around the world, all of the time, and it all impinges and touches on our lives in ways that we are completely oblivious to because we're part of this global village. A few years later, I was teaching in a privileged boys' grammar school in a wealthy part of the southwest of England. I was teaching an A-level general studies class, and the theme that I'd been given was third world issues, as it was called back then. I remember working with these privileged kids. It was in the run-up to the year 2000, and I was talking about issues like Jubilee 2000 and the campaign to write off international debt. I remember using a tier fund coffee game which simulated the realities of global trade. And for some of the kids, as they saw the inequalities and they saw how much of the actual price that is paid for coffee in the shop, how much of that went to the coffee growers of the beans in places like Brazil and Ethiopia, and how much went to the retailers and the roasters like Nescafe. For some of these kids, as they saw this, it awakened passion in them. They recognised the inequality. For some of them, there was apathy. Why do we need to know this? Some called me a communist, a familiar cry. I realise when I lived in Maromeo, I guess, for me, this was a moment of not just playing a board game with kids. This was a time of actually really seeing with my eyes and experiencing and living in the global village, where I couldn't hide from it. I couldn't isolate myself from it. I couldn't pretend it didn't exist. I lived in a world in Maromeo where perhaps 1 or 2% of the 40,000 people living there were enjoying great wealth. Another 1 or 2% had reasonable jobs and quite good wages. But the vast majority, 95% or more of the people, if they had a job at all, were earning a subsistence wage and were really struggling in very challenging situations. That was the reality I faced. And I realised that although most people don't see it in quite the same way, that actually is a microcosm of the world we live in, even today. I was looking earlier at some statistics. I saw some statistics from Oxfam. For some reason I couldn't find anything more recent than 2013. But in these 2013 statistics, and I realise you can make statistics say anything you want to, and you can mistrust them, and they may not be fully accurate. But in these stats, Oxfam claimed that the richest 1% of the world's population own 48% of global wealth. And the richest 10% own 85% of global wealth. Meanwhile, the bottom half of the adult world population own just 1% of global wealth. That is extraordinarily unjust. Such inequalities. If nothing else, those extremes are dangerous. I recognise that I'm one of the privileged. I come from one of the wealthy nations. And even though my nation has billionaires and it has homeless living on the streets, so it still has gross inequalities, I realise that I am one of the privileged. How do I choose to live in this reality? It's complicated. It's incredibly complicated. I know it's not better to be poor than rich. I know it's not somehow more spiritual, although it's interesting that Paul said that God has chosen the poor to be rich in faith. I know that there are many, many complicated worldview issues that hold people in poverty. But I also know that there are gross structural injustices that hold people in poverty. I know that giving can hurt, that giving's not always good, that it can cause dependency. And I know as well that there is more to wealth and happiness and wholeness than simply income. But I can't escape the reality of a place like Maromeo. While I'm living in Spain, in a sense, I can be a little bit more isolated from it. And I can choose to bury myself. I can choose to ignore what's happening in other parts of the world. In Maromeo, I couldn't. It was in my face. How do I live in such a world? Liberation theologians talk about God's preferential option for the poor. And I can't escape the fact that God so clearly is portrayed as having a heart for the widow and the orphan, the refugee. He is a God of justice. I can't escape the fact that Jesus loved people that Jesus was often highly critical of the elite and the privileged and the religious and the wealthy. I can't escape the fact that God is a God who blesses, that we're blessed to be a blessing, that it's wonderful when we're able to give out of our abundance to bless other people. But there is a challenge. How do I live? At that time back in Marimow, I remember trying to really wrestle with this and think about it. I was struck, and I talked in an earlier story about this, I was struck by, in Matthew 9, when Jesus looks at the crowd and he has compassion on them because they're harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Compassion. It's a powerful word. I was reading at that time an article by Floyd McClung called Apostolic Passion. He talks about passion and refers to the Passion Week, the week of Christ's suffering, and passion is to do with suffering. He talks about apostolic passion as the things that I am willing to suffer for. And I recognise that compassion is not simply a feeling. It's not empathy. It's not having pity for someone. Compassion is being willing to suffer with people. And when I look at the life of Jesus, I see his willingness to come and be with us, his willingness to be the message of God's love incarnated in human community. His willingness to be the man of sorrows, familiar with suffering, to suffer with us, to suffer on our behalf, yes, but also to share in our suffering. And I'm challenged. What does it look like for me to have compassion? What does it look like for me to identify with people, with where they're at, to live with them? I come from a country where politics is really built around economics. Our country and many other countries as well have kind of bought into, I think it's a lie, that we have a divine right to enjoy perpetual economic growth. I can't see any logical reason why that would be true, and I certainly can't see a biblical reason for it, but we seem to expect growth continually. Our politicians are often billionaires. The choices they're making are around protecting economic interests. There's something really, really refreshing in this current crisis to see particular politicians taking a pay cut, choosing to express solidarity with those who are losing their jobs. That's refreshing. It feels like in this season, we're probably going to have even more chances than ever to choose how we're going to posture ourselves towards inequality. We live in an unequal world. So the question facing me every day is, how am I going to engage this world? How do I choose to live? How do I choose to love? How do I choose to spend myself and my resources?